Imagine stepping onto a busy morning bus, and someone suddenly rises to offer you their seat. For a moment, you might pause, unsure whether to accept, unsure whether they genuinely meant it, unsure simply because it doesn't happen as often anymore. Yet, for many of us who grew up in the Britain of the 50s through the 80s, this tiny gesture was once as familiar as the rumble of the engine or the smell of damp coats after a spell of rain. It was part of a quiet language of respect we all understood, a silent agreement that we looked out for one another. Today, though, such courtesy can feel almost surprising, leaving younger generations puzzled and visitors wondering if they've stepped into another era. And that small moment opens the door to a much larger story about how British manners once shaped everyday life. In post-war Britain, the very fabric of society was woven together by the threads of politeness, respect, and what we now call the stiff upper lip. It wasn't just about good manners, it was about national pride, a shared understanding that civility was what set the British apart. After the war, as the nation rebuilt, a quiet, dignified restraint became a symbol of strength. Manners weren't optional. They were the cornerstone of daily life, both in public and in private. Take something as simple as queuing. In a Britain still scarred by wartime shortages, people lined up in silence whether for bread, coal, or a seat on the bus, never pushing, never complaining. It was understood that waiting your turn was as much a part of life as breathing. Being polite wasn't just about making others feel comfortable. It was about maintaining order and decency in a society still finding its feet. This shared etiquette was the unspoken glue that held communities together. These small, everyday actions reflected the values of a generation that endured hardship and was determined to rebuild with quiet pride and impeccable manners. In the Britain of the 1950s through the 1980s, manners were more than a social nicety. They were the unspoken rituals that governed daily life. Take, for example, the art of queuing. To stand in line wasn't just practical, it was a sacred duty. Whether it was at the post office, the bakery, or the bus stop, people queued with military precision, each person knowing their place in the orderly line. There was an almost reverent silence as you waited your turn. Everyone waited. No one cut in. The subtle pressure of expectation ensured that even the most impatient souls conformed. Today, in a world of instant gratification, such patience seems almost quaint. The sight of a disorganized crowd jostling for position or cutting ahead in line might even seem normal to younger generations. But for many of us, it still feels uncomfortable loss of something deeply ingrained in our collective identity. Then, there was the time-honored practice of offering your seat. On buses, trains, or even at social gatherings, it was considered a matter of decency to stand up and offer your place to women, the elderly, or anyone in need. This wasn't done for attention. It was simply expected. It was an unspoken code, a small but significant act of kindness that communicated respect for others. In today's world, where we often find ourselves glued to our phones or plugged into headphones, the idea of offering up a seat without being asked can be almost surprising. Would it even be noticed if you did? Or would people assume you were doing it for some kind of ulterior motive? The simple act of offering your seat is now seen less often, and its absence says something about how manners have evolved, perhaps eroded over time. Another key pillar of British manners was the art of conversation, especially when it came to not interrupting others. If you were speaking to someone, whether in a crowded pub or a family gathering, there was a certain reverence for listening. Interruptions were a sign of disrespect. To cut someone off mid-sentence was almost unthinkable. People spoke with pauses, with thoughtfulness, respecting the rhythm of the conversation. There was a balance between talking and listening, where the art of listening was just as important as the art of speaking. Contrast this with today's fast-paced, often fragmented conversations, where jumping in, finishing sentences, or even talking over someone has become commonplace. It's hard to imagine that just a few decades ago, listening was considered as much of a skill as speaking. The smooth, respectful flow of conversation, where everyone had their turn, seems like a relic in today's world of rapid exchanges and social media soundbites. Titles and honorifics were another cornerstone of British manners. In the past, using a person's title, whether Sir, Madam, or Mr., was the expected form of address. Whether you were speaking to a colleague, a neighbor, or a stranger, titles showed respect for the other person's position and standing. It didn't matter whether they were in a suit or overalls. The title was a way to acknowledge their dignity. Today, we're more casual, often addressing one another by first names or even nicknames, without thinking twice. The formality of titles has faded, and with it, the sense of hierarchy and structure they once represented. In a world where boundaries are constantly being redefined, titles seem old-fashioned, even a bit stuffy. Yet, there was something comforting about that small but significant act of acknowledgement. It was a sign of respect that said, "I see you for who you are." And then there was the silence at the dinner table, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but quietly respectful. Meals were times of reflection, of contemplation, or perhaps of just being in the moment together. There was no need for endless chatter to fill the air. The act of eating itself often spoke volumes. It wasn't about the food, it was about the company, the shared experience of sitting together. Families, particularly in the post-war era, had long struggled to put food on the table, and so mealtimes were sacred. Today, with television screens in every corner of the home, smartphones at the table, and constant noise in the background, the silence that once defined British meals seems like a distant memory. Eating together now often feels like a race to get through the meal rather than a time for quiet reflection. The ritual of the family meal, where conversation might have been sparse but presence was felt deeply, has been replaced by something far more distracted. Each of these practices, the cue, the offered seat, the art of conversation, the use of titles, the quiet of mealtimes, was rooted in respect, hierarchy, and social order. They were the manners that defined a time, a place, and a people. They spoke volumes about how people saw themselves and their relationships with one another. Today, in a faster, more informal world, these rituals feel strange, even foreign. But they weren't just customs, they were the glue that held society together, a gentle reminder of the values that once underpinned British life. In the end, these old manners mattered because they were more than habits. They were a quiet reflection of who we believed ourselves to be. They offered a sense of dignity in a world still recovering from hardship, where keeping one's composure wasn't just expected, was admired. Politeness was a form of emotional discipline, a way of showing that even when life felt uncertain, we could carry ourselves with grace. It wasn't about pretending everything was perfect. It was about preserving a sense of steadiness through the rituals of everyday life. And beneath all of it was a deep respect for community. These gestures, waiting your turn, offering a seat, listening without interruption, were tiny threads holding society together. They reminded us that we were part of something larger, something that relied on mutual consideration. Today, as life moves faster and feels more fragmented, there's a longing for that sense of cohesion, that shared understanding of how to treat one another. Looking back, we realize those small acts were never really small. At all, they shaped the emotional rhythm of a nation. So, if someone offered you their seat today, you might pause, simply because the gesture feels rare. It makes us wonder what happened to the quiet values that once shaped British life. Globalization, crowded commutes, and the pull of technology have shifted our attention inward, leaving fewer chances for those gentle courtesies. Yet, the warmth we feel when they appear reminds us why they mattered. The modern world isn't necessarily worse, just faster, louder, and less intentional than the one we remember. But the spirit of those old manners never truly vanished. Just a little kindness, waiting patiently, mattered once more.